Chapter 11: East, West, and a Drop of Blood. How the VOC divided the world with Britain. In the 17th century, the planet was rapidly shrinking. The seas contracted and the sails, shores drew even closer, and the main players understood land is the finite resource, and if you want a monopoly, you'll have to defend or buy it. Thus, the Dutch East India Company clashed with another power, equally ambitious, equally greedy, equally predatory, the British East India Company, established just 2 years earlier. Initially, their path rarely crossed. The British entrenched themselves in India, while the Dutch focused on the Moluccas and Southeast Asia. But as their trading empires grew, their spheres of influence began to overlap. And then it became clear two predators couldn't feed on the same archipelago. The situation became particularly tense on the aforementioned Banda Islands, where in 1616 the English occupied the island of Ran, a tiny dot where the richest nutmeg plantation stood. The VOC fiercely fought for the return of the island, imposing blockades, sending landing parties, and conducting negotiations. However, the English held it stubbornly. Decades later, after a series of conflicts, raids, and diplomatic maneuvers, the companies realized that constant warfare was unprofitable. It was not only expensive, but also futile. Ships sank, markets were lost, profits fell. And so, in 1667, the Treaty of Breda was concluded, an agreement that would later be called one of the most astonishing in geopolitical history. On these terms, Holland permanently received the island of Ran, and in return ceded Manhattan Island to Britain. Yes, that very Manhattan, a small Dutch settlement named New Amsterdam, passed into British hands, and they in turn renamed it New York, in honor of the Duke of York, the future King James II. The deal at first glance seemed strange, but if viewed through the eyes of 17th century people, it was absolutely logical. Ran gained control over nutmeg, while Manhattan was just a cold, damp patch of land off the coast of North America, where almost no one lived and nothing grew. Some saw it as a colonial burden, others as gold on a nutmeg branch. History judged otherwise. New York became the capital of the world, while the island of Ran almost disappeared from the map of importance. But then, in 1667, the VOC considered itself the victor. It had achieved a complete monopoly on nutmeg. Control was absolute. The spice brought tens of thousands of percent in profit, shares soared, and stock exchanges rejoiced. In parallel, the Dutch signed another important agreement with the English on mutual non-interference in their zones of influence. India went to the British, the East Indies to the VOC. Formally, it was peace. In reality, it was a division of the world. Companies became global political actors. Not kings, not parliaments, not republics, but exactly joint stock companies began to determine which territories would develop, which would suffocate, where roads would be built, and where plantations would burn. This was a new era, an era of corporate imperialism. But behind this peaceful agreement has always lay blood, because to own an island, one had not just to sign a treaty, but to hold it, to subdue the locals, to destroy competitors, bribe chiefs, to bring slaves. And both companies, the VOC and the British, did this with the same cold bloodness. They did not build temples, they didn't bring religion, they didn't read manifestos. They built factories, flotillas, and warehouses. And instead of sacred scriptures, they carried barrels of gunpowder and stack of contracts. This was the colonial world, built not on ideas, but on goods, percentages, balance sheets, and logistics. In the next chapter, we'll look into the shadows of this dominance, to the island of Formosa, where the VOC tried to build a new model of governance and encountered unexpected resistance. Chapter 12: Taiwan, which did not yield. Sometimes, even the most powerful structure, even the most calculating empire suffers defeat. Not because of enemies, but because of calamities, but simply because of the world refuses to submit completely. Such a place for the Dutch East India Company was the island that on Asian maps was listed as Formosa, which in Portuguese means beautiful. Today we know it as Taiwan. The first Europeans reached the shores of Taiwan in the early 17th century. The Portuguese, as usual, gave it a name and sailed on. The Spanish briefly settled in the north, but the main player became the VOC, which landed in the southwest of the island in 1624. The Dutch quickly built Fort Zeelandia, named after a Dutch province. It became the administrative center of their new colony. The idea was simple. Taiwan was a strategic point between China, Japan, and the Philippines. A convenient harbor, fertile lands, potential trade with the mainland. But there was one nuance: the local tribes, and another nuance: China. The Dutch, unwilling to repeat the full extent of Indonesian brutalities, decided to act cunningly. They began a missionary and educational program, hired locals for the police, taught them to the Dutch language, conducted village inventories, and imposed taxes. Taiwan became an experiment in colonization, not by bayonets, but by bureaucracy and cultural pressure. On paper, it looked good, in reality not so much. The tribes didn't want to pay, submit, pray, learn, or work for foreigners. The resistance wasn't frontal, but it slowly eroded the VOC structure from within. Assassinations of officials, escapes, and most importantly, economic instability. Revenues from the island were low, expenses constant. But the worst was yet to come. In 1661, a man landed on Taiwan who became a nightmare for the Dutch, Jan Changong, also known as Koxinga, a semi-legendary Chinese pirate, patriot, and military leader who declared war on the Manchu Qing dynasty, but decided to first capture the VOC based in Taiwan. He had 25,000 men and dozens of ships. The Dutch had about 2,000, half of whom were local and poorly trained. The siege of Zeelandia lasted 9 months. The garrison suffered from hunger, disease, and lack of supplies. Reinforcements from Batavia did not arrive. Too far, too expensive, too late. In 1662, after grueling siege, the Dutch surrendered. This was the first major defeat of the VOC in Asia. Formosa ceased to be a colony. It never brought the company much money, did not become a logistics hub, and did not submit to either arms or bureaucracy. Chen Gong transformed Taiwan into his own state, albeit for several decades. And the VOC lost face. In Batavia there was a scandal. The Governor General was accused of incompetence, shareholders lost millions, and the reputation was undermined. But the most interesting thing is this. Formosa showed that even a giant, even a corporate behemoth, even the VOC could suffer defeat if it relied too heavily on schemes and underestimated the strength of local will. Taiwan was not Banda. Here it was not possible to wipe everyone out and start anew. Here was an enemy equal in strength and persistence. This was a crack in the hull of the ship on which the VOC sailed, unnoticed but ominous, showing that everything is subject to market and muskets. Loyalty cannot be bought everywhere, and not everyone can be intimidated. After Taiwan, the company continued to expand, but the shadow of this defeat already lay over future expeditions. In Ceylon, in India, in Bengal, they did not surrender, but their confidence was no longer the same, and history, as we know, does not forgive weakness, even temporary. Chapter 13: Ceylon and the cinnamon tax. If the island of Banda gave the VOC a monopoly on nutmeg, then the next step was cinnamon, another spice considered almost mystical in Europe. It was used not only in cooking, but also in medicine, perfumery, and religious rituals. It symbolized wealth, health, and power. And the source of the best cinnamon in the world is the island of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka. Initially, the VOC did not seriously claim the island. The Portuguese were already there, having established their forts and alliances with local rulers. But after expulsion of the Portuguese from the Moluccas, the Dutch realized Ceylon was the next logical step. They began to act cautiously, but methodically. First diplomacy, then forts, then the army. By 1658, the Portuguese were finally pushed out, and the island came under VOC control. And here began the spicy bureaucracy. The company didn't just station a harrison, it created a cinnamon tax system, almost the first fiscal model in history based on a plant. Every village, every collector, every cinnamon bush was accounted for, registered and controlled. The local population was obliged to submit a certain amount of bark per year. If the norm was not met, punishments followed, sometimes in the form of corporal punishment. The plantations of themselves were supervised directly from Batavia. Cinnamon inspectors were introduced to check the quality, harvest times, and the conditions of the bushes. Production was organized on the principle of nothing superfluous, only the necessary quantity, the necessary variety, everything else was uprooted. This was monoculture in its ideal embodiment. and the VOC stripped tens of thousands of percent in profits from it. Ceylon quickly became the company's second heart after Batavia. Supplies to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa passed through it. And parallel to cinnamon, slavery began to actively develop. Workers were brought to the plantations from Madagascar, India, and Indonesia. They were not taught to collect bark, they were simply lined up and forced. But surprisingly, the local Sinhalese proved to be a more complex partner than plants. They weren't tribes. They had their own culture, religion, and knowledge of the terrain. And despite the occupation, they constantly rebelled, attacked warehouses, and carried out sabotage. The kingdom of Kandy, located in the mountains, especially resisted and was never fully subdued by either the Portuguese or the VOC. Periodically, the Dutch would conduct campaigns against Kandy, sign temporary agreements, retreat, and return. This was a simmering war in which no one definitely won. But in the VOC accounting books, everything looked stable. Supplies were coming in, profits were flowing, spices were loaded into barrels. Ceylon became another example of how the VOC was able to integrate a territory into its corporate culture without necessarily owning it completely. They didn't try to convert locals to Christianity or build European cities. They simply took the goods and sent them on. Everything else was an expense, especially human lives. Cinnamon from Ceylon was supplied to Europe under strict control. It was packaged, weighed, and sold at auctions. Each batch had its own stamp, its own number. It was commodity almost equivalent to currency. At the same time, the VOC actively propagated in Europe, created an image of exotic distant lands where valiant merchants civilized wild peoples. In reality, everything came down to a scheme: take, export, sell, divide. And cinnamon, with its delicate scent and thin bark, became a symbol of this duplicity of colonialism, a spicy wrapper for a system built on coercion. But even cinnamon couldn't mask the main problem. The VOC had become too large, too expensive to manage, and too dependent on colonial wars. And as long as the spices flowed, everything worked. But as soon as they slowed down, the mechanism began to creak. Ceylon remained profitable but unstable. And then came other territories, even more dangerous and unpredictable. Chapter 14: Dejima, Japan's Window to Europe. In the 17th century, Japan entered a special era of its history, the Edo period, governed by the Tokugawa shogunate. It was an era of stability, order, and isolation. Japan almost completely closed its borders, prohibiting foreigners from entering and Japanese from leaving. Violations were punishable by death. The entire outside world became a dangerous virus for the Japanese, one that needed to be kept under control. Nevertheless, they were willing to let something in, especially if it brought profit. Therefore, in 1641, the only European nation allowed to trade with Japan was not the Portuguese, but precisely the Dutch from the VOC. Why? It was simple. The VOC agreed to play by Japanese rules. No missionaries, no cross, no claims on souls. Only goods, only business relations. And Japan appreciated this cold respect for its borders. The Dutch were settled on the artificial island of Dejima, approximately 120 meters long and 70 meters wide, in the harbor of Nagasaki. It was a trading cage with gates, guards, and a bridge leading to the mainland. The Dutch were not allowed to go outside, not allowed to bring women, and required to observe Japanese customs. They were inspected, monitored, and interrogated. It was trade under total control. But in return, the VOC gained a monopoly on the entire Japanese market. The Dutch became the only window into Japanese civilization. Through them, knowledge about Japanese medicine, languages, the culture entered Europe. It was the VOC that created the first Japanese-Dutch dictionary. It was through them that Japan studied Western science called Rangaku, the Dutch learning. Every arrival of a VOC ship became an event. Dutch captains and residents reported to the shogun, brought gifts, and held receptions. This was trade as diplomacy, carefully calibrated, with minimal presence but maximum output. And what is astonishing, no other European state had such a permanent channel of communication with Japan for almost 200 years. While the English and French broke into other countries with cannons, the VOC simply followed instructions. For Japan, it was convenient. They received the necessary technologies, remained isolated, and maintained the illusion of complete closure. For the VOC, it brought prestige, status, and a stable flow of rare goods. And although the trade volumes were more modest than in Ceylon or Java, the political and cultural significance of Dejima was gigantic. The Dutch proved that they could not only be conquerors, but also quiet observers if the situation demanded it. This unique balance held until the mid-19th century, when the Americans arrived and opened Japan by force. But until then, the VOC and Dejima were linked like secret allies, living in trust, restrictions, and polite calculations. This was an unusual chapter of colonialism, where there was no shooting or slaughter, where they simply sat on a small island and waited, but they waited with profit. Chapter 15: Bengal and a failure in India. India is often associated with the British, and rightly so. The British East India Company firmly established itself on the subcontinent, turning it into the heart of its colonial empire. But before Britain finally captured Bengal, other flags had already touched its shores, and among them the flag of the VOC. The Dutch East India Company came to India with the same goal it had in Indonesia: to obtain goods, build factories, organize logistics, and extract profits. But in Java and Ceylon, they had to clear jungles and subdue tribes. In India, everything was different. Here, empires already existed. There were complex political alliances, extensive trade networks, and players who knew the price of any agreement. The VOC's first presence in India began in the Bengal region, which was then part of the Mughal Empire. It was a storehouse of textiles, indigo, rice, opium, and salt. Bengali cotton, thin, light, almost transparent, like a spider web, was especially famous. In Europe, it became a luxurious commodity. The Dutch established factories in Chinsura, Patna, Kazim and Berhampur. They concluded agreements with local Nawabs, rulers of districts, and traded directly bypassing competitors. On paper, everything looked good. Goods flowed, warehouses filled up, and ships departed from Batavia and Amsterdam. But India was a different best beast. Here you couldn't just land and declare yourself the owner. Here the game was played among the Mughals, French, British, Marathas, Sikhs, and countless internal factions. The Dutch had to maneuver, negotiate, endure losses, and most importantly, constantly lose the initiative. In the mid-18th century, everything became more complicated. The British grew stronger. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the British East India Company effectively became the ruling power in Bengal. The Dutch tried to intervene. In 1759, they sent an armed expedition to regain influence and overthrow the British. This led to the Battle of Bidera, a little known but important event. The result was catastrophic. The British routed the Dutch. Their troops were captured and their ships were sunk. The VOC lost not only its military position, but also its reputation. From then on, their presence in India began to steadily decline. Their factories closed, agreements were terminated, and warehouses emptied. The VOC's problem in India was systemic. The company acted as a trading mechanism, unable to adapt to a new reality, a reality where it was necessary not just to buy and sell, but to govern, intrigue, conquer, and hold territory. The British understood this and implemented an administrative machine, an army and diplomacy. The Dutch tried to do everything the old way and lost. Unlike Batavia or Ceylon, where the VOC could dictate terms, in Bengal it always remained a guest on borrowed time. And when the wind of change blew hard, this guest was simply shown the door. Bengal became the frontier beyond which the Dutch East India Company could no longer compete on equal terms. It did not disappear, but became secondary, and this was the beginning of the end. Ahead of the VOC was its last big bet, the Cape Colony in South Africa, where it was still possible to build from scratch. Chapter 16. The VOC's last bet, the Cape Colony. At the southern tip of Africa, where the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean, lies the Cape of Good Hope. The VOC ships traveling from Europe to the East Indies. This place was not just a geographical marker, it was a moment of truth. Here it was decided whether they would reach spices, gold, and glory, or end up feeding the sharks. The journey was long, difficult, and exhausting. Therefore, at some point, the corporation needed a reliable staging post. Thus, the Cape Colony emerged. In 1652, the Dutch sailor Jan van Riebeek, on behalf of the VOC, established a factory in the bay near the Cape. The area was harsh but promising. Fertile soil, fresh water, a convenient harbor, and most importantly, the opportunity to create what had long been lost in Asia, a territory that could be developed from scratch, without competitors, without old agreements, and resistance from major empires. The Cape Colony was initially conceived as a logistical hub, a place where ships could replenish water supplies, undergo repairs, and wait out storms. But gradually, it became something more. Boer farmers, predominantly from Holland, but also from Germany and France, began to settle there. They raised livestock, grew grapes, and built houses in the Dutch style. Within a few decades, a new world emerged on the edge of Africa, a colony with European laws, language, and customs. But there was also a dark side. The local peoples, the Khoikhoi, San, and Totentots, found themselves in a situation familiar from other regions. They were displaced, enslaved, and turned into laborers. As in the East Indies, the VOC didn't shy away from using slave labor. Moreover, slaves were brought not only from Africa, but also from India, Indonesia, and even Madagascar. The Cape Colony quickly transformed into an ethically diverse but deeply hierarchical system. The Dutch at the top, everyone else at the bottom. The company itself profited from the trade in wine, meats, hides, and sheep resurfacing. Kaapstad, modern-day Cape Town, became a strategic hub, somewhat like a gas station for the VOC empire. But even despite the importance of this colony, it could not save the company from the general crisis. While the Cape Colony developed, the VOC lost influence in Asia. The British and French pushed it out of India, trade in Japan almost ceased, and rebellions flared up in Ceylon. Management became increasingly inefficient and corruption ate away at the remnants of discipline. Even giants can court and fall, especially if their structure is built on resource extraction rather than adaptation. The Cape Colony would endure for a long time, first under VOC control, then transferred to the British, and later becoming the cradle of the wide population of South Africa. But for the VOC, it remained the final attempt to fix everything, a gamble on a reboot, a beginning that could not stop the end. Today's Cape Town grew precisely from this VOC outpost, a city where Europe, Africa, and Asia intersected. It began with a small fortification at the Cape, a history etched in geography. Chapter 17: Opium, the company's shadow commodity. When one speaks of the Dutch East India Company, the imagination conjures up holds full of nutmeg, cinnamon, and pepper. But there is another commodity, dark, quiet, taboo, that brought the company stable income and left far more long-lasting consequences. We are talking about opium. The VOC began trading opium practically from its inception. Opium was cultivated in India, especially in the regions of Bengal and Bihar, where the climate allowed for stable harvests. Initially, it was intended for medicinal purposes, but it quickly became clear the demand for it was much wider and much more dangerous. China became the key market. Contrary to modern stereotypes, the first major supplier of opium to China was not the British, but precisely the Dutch. The VOC sold Indian opium to Chinese intermediaries who then distributed it within the country. This was a contraband market, officially prohibited by imperial decree, but flourishing under the cover of officials, traders, and pirates. Opium brought immediate and sustained profits. It was light in weight, concentrated in value, did not spoil in transit, and caused physical addiction, meaning stable demand. For the VOC, it was an ideal commodity during periods when spice supplies declined or market prices fell. The company built a complex logistics system. Indian opium was transported to South China through trading centers in Malacca, Batavia, and Formosa. Unmarked vessels were used, and deals were conducted through dummy agents. All of this allowed the VOC to maintain the facade of a respectable trading society without publicizing what was actually loaded into the holds. Interestingly, the Dutch themselves never made opium a central commodity. It was more an insurance buffer, a means of financing other operations, but at the same time, it had a disproportionately large impact on the VOC economy and moral perception in the eyes of some peoples, especially the Chinese. Later, in the 19th century, when the British East India Company would make opium its main export to China, the Opium Wars would begin. The Qing dynasty would fall and China would be dismembered. But the first scars on the body of Celestial Empire were left by the VOC. In Holland itself, they preferred to remain silent about the opium trade. It wasn't included in engravings of ships, wasn't mentioned in poems about spices, and did not appear in reports for shareholders. But in drafts, in cargo documents, in secret instructions, opium was there. It was transported, it was sold, it was counted on. Historians today evaluate the scale of this trade as moderate, but regular and stable. Opium became an economical glue, allowing the VOC to maintain its fleet, finance garrisons, and cover losses from spice crop failures or unsuccessful trading missions. And like much in the history of the VOC, this commodity became a symbol of ambivalence. The corporation, considered the pinnacle of rationality, civilization, and commercial genius, ran one of the first organized international drug trafficking schemes, long before cartels and underground syndicates. And it was this quiet, unnoticed trade that perhaps was one of the reasons why the Chinese later chose to close themselves off from the entire West, and the name European merchant became synonymous with not with trust, but with poisoning. Chapter 18: The demise of the VOC and its legacy in history. At some point, it seems as if the machine will run forever, that profits will flow endlessly, that spices will never run out, ships won't sink, officials won't become corrupt, and shareholders won't revolt. But history laughs at these expectations, because any empire, no matter how rational, sooner or later faces the costs of growth. The Dutch India Company became the wealthiest corporation in human history by the end of the 18th century. Its assets, when converted to modern currency, were valued in tens of trillions of dollars. It was the world's first structure to combine colonialism, trade, diplomacy, military force, and the stock exchange into a single system. The VOC was not just a corporation, it was a state without a nation. However, From the late 18th century onwards, the mechanism became to falter. Firstly, management. A network of dozens of factories, colonies, garrisons, and ports required a huge administrative apparatus. The further its territory stretched, the more time it took to make decisions, and the more corruption flourished. Local officials turned into rulers, pursuing personal gain. Secondly, competition. The British East India Company became increasingly aggressive and successful. France, Denmark, Spain, and Portugal all tried to seize the initiative. China and Japan tightened trade conditions. Indian markets fell under British control. The VOC lost share after share. Thirdly, profit. Spices were no longer a rarity. Nutmeg, cinnamon, pepper all became readily available commodities. And when a commodity ceases to be luxury, it ceases to be super profitable. Prices fell, and maintaining the colonies became more expensive than the profits they yielded. The VOC was no longer earning, it was surviving. By the early 19th century, the situation became critical. The company held on only by its old authority and financial injections from the mother country. Debts accumulated, shareholders were dissatisfied, and society was changing. The age of enlightenment did not favor semi-military monopolies acting like a pirate fleet under an accountant's flag. In 1799, the VOC was officially dissolved. All its assets, debts, possessions, and documents were transferred to the state, the Batavian Republic created in the French-occupied Netherlands. In essence, the Dutch East India Company ceased to exist, dissolving in the storm of revolutions and geopolitical shifts. But here what's striking, Holland as a country benefited. Despite the collapse of the VOC, its century of profits fueled the country's economies, finances, culture, and architecture. Amsterdam became the banking center of Europe, its stock exchange a model to imitate, and the Dutch bourgeoisie one of the most enlightened and wealthiest in the world. The VOC created an infrastructure of wealth on which the Netherlands stood for another century. Yes, then came the Napoleonic Wars, the loss of colonies, German invasions. But the trace of the VOC did not disappear, and to this day, in Amsterdam, The Hague, the Rotterdam, you can find buildings constructed with spices and dividends. In a broader sense, the VOC became the prototype of a modern corporation. It was with it that joint stock companies with public share offerings began, along with international logistics and standardized trade routes, the interaction of corporations with governments, and the idea that business could wage war and maintain an army. And most importantly, the feeling that money governs states, not the other way around. This was an economic revolution, no less important than the industrial one. The VOC did not just deliver spices, it defined the very nature of power. And however bitter it may be, the VOC's path became a warning that an immeasurable thirst for profit combined with violence and exploitation ultimately destroys the very structure built in such a way. The VOC died, but its shadows still hovers in the head offices of multinational corporations, at container terminals, in offshore zones, in logos and dividends. The spices ran out, the profits faded, the VOC perished, but the global system changed forever. Thank you for joining me on this journey, following the footsteps of the most powerful trading empire of the past. In another lecture, we will definitely tell you about its eternal competitor, the British-based India Company, and how it swallowed not only spices but entire peoples. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and share with friends to delve into the world of knowledge and mysteries together. See you next time.